Well, thank you for inviting me. It's great to see so many of you here today who are interested in looking at this topic. And I've just been asked to set the scene on what are we really here to think about today. And as a Director of Public Health, I'm very pleased to be here at an event like this, because healthy diet, good food, it's really good for health. But poverty is bad for health. So in many ways, I wish I didn't need to be here. It is depressing and disturbing that in modern-day Scotland, we require emergency provision of food and we require food banks. And that's disturbing on so many levels, but Nick Saul from Toronto, from the STOP project that I think you'll hear more about today, later on, said, most people who have to visit food banks say it is a slow, painful death of the soul. And over the past few years, as you all know, we've seen a rise in the provision and the need for food banks. The Guardian called 2012 the year of the food bank, the dawn of a new era of emergency food provision, and it has continued since then. And food banks were set up as a very legitimate and real response to the growing need. We're living in difficult financial circumstances. We're living through what is probably the most punitive welfare reform that we've seen since the welfare state began. And we know that many people who attend food banks say they're attending because of benefit sanctions. Last week, I attended the inaugural meeting of the Welfare Reform Network, part of Policy Scotland. And at that event, David Webster talked to us about the scale of sanctions. And he showed us that 6.5% of JSA claimants are being sanctioned every single month. And that has increased 2.75 times since 2010. More than 1 in 5 of all JSA claimants have been sanctioned in the last 5 years. And a third of those who are sanctioned more than once. So we're seeing more sanctions, and we're seeing sanctions that are applied for a longer period of time. And it may get worse. When universal credit is introduced, it could draw another 1.2 million people into the sanction regime. So we need to speak about the underlying issues that are causing food poverty. And how can we influence them? How can we prevent this punitive regime? How can we support people to avoid sanctions? But there are other drivers, as well as welfare reform, behind the increase in the use of food banks. As you know, we're seeing more and more in-work poverty, more people experiencing poverty despite having paid work. And that's because of the low wages, the insecure jobs, wage stagnation, the increase in the cost of living, especially in food prices, and especially often in healthy food prices. We have to also consider today the local retail and transport infrastructure in order to bring about sustainable solutions. And we should remember that accommodation status and access to adequate cooking facilities will also influence whether somebody is experiencing food poverty. And in response to these needs, we've seen marvellous work happen, haven't we? The establishment of food banks, people collecting and donating to food banks, people running food banks, volunteering and working in food banks. The all-party parliamentary group on food poverty said that many food banks demonstrate the best aspects of human nature. People coming together, seeing a need and responding to it. But food banks are not, and nor are they designed to be, a long-term solution to food poverty. The recent Demos report that many of you may have seen or heard talked about in the media, British Isles it was called, suggested that many people who use food banks are not just doing it because of a crisis. They're doing it because of chronic food poverty, a long-term inability to afford food because of entrenched poverty. The report says, for these families, a referral to a food bank is more likely to be triggered by a crunch point than a crisis point. the slow dwindling of resources until the last tin of soup is used up or the payday credit is exhausted. For those in chronic food poverty, 9 days free food a year may be a vital lifeline, but their food bank voucher does not address the problem faced during the remaining 356 days, that incomes are not stretching to afford adequate food for their families. We hear sometimes that it's DWP themselves who are referring people to food banks. We shouldn't let food banks be part of our social security system. They should not be accepted as a normal way of life here in Scotland. Many people who go to food banks need a lot more support than just that access to and provision of food. Again, the APPG report on food poverty recommended local food bank plus models that would address more of the underlying causes of food poverty. And I know that many of you here who run food banks will be already providing some of these other services, either providing financial advice or cookery classes at the same site, or signposting people, referring them on to other supports in the community. And also providing a listening ear, someone to talk to, that social connectedness that will be so important for people. Some other models have also been suggested, and many of these are going to be talked about in your workshops today. Some really exciting models that are being looked at there. That Demos report talked about community supermarkets, where food's for sale, but it's for sale below the market prices. It's sold as groceries, not as prepared meals, and as a social purpose for tackling food poverty. And I know there's been a lot of debate about these different models or these alternatives to food banks. The Trussell Trust commented on that Demos report and said that even affordable food is not affordable if you've absolutely no money. So the food can be as cheap as anything, but if you've got no money at all, you still can't buy it. So we do need food banks right now, today. We still need them. People are still in these crises. But that's not the model we want as we go forward. How can we prevent us needing food banks? And by thinking about new models and a future beyond food banks, or how do we prevent the need for food banks, it's not to underestimate the vital role they're playing here today, right now in Scotland. And we've got a great group of people here to think about the future. You've come from a whole range of backgrounds and areas. We need voluntary organisations that are going to look at new and different models, and let's hear more about them today. We need people who are volunteering in food banks and using food banks to say what would actually help in terms of moving beyond this. We need businesses that can look at how to recycle surplus food. We need the statutory organisations, the NHS like myself, to think, how do we respond to this? And we need to remember that wonderful mantra of the Poverty Truth Commission: nothing about us without us is for us. So we need to involve the people who are experiencing these circumstances. So we're here today to recognise the really good work that's gone on, the best of human nature, as I've said, the setting up and running of food banks, donating, supporting people in that crisis time. But we're also here to think about how might we make that response better? How can we do more of the other services and connect better to them? But also to think about what are better models for the future to prevent food poverty, to have a more sustainable solution. And we're not coming here with any answers. We'll come here with suggestions, proposals that you'll hear about in your workshops. But this is a genuine conversation to say, where do we go from here? And what are the actions that you want to come out of today to start planning for a new model and a more sustainable model? One of the greatest feelings in the world is knowing that we as individuals can make a difference. There's lots of things we think we can't change, we can't influence, but surely, surely we can make sure that we prevent hunger here in Scotland today. Thanks.